Prime Minister Mark Carney just before returning home from the G20 summit. While in Johannesburg, he announced Canada and India have agreed to launch negotiations towards a new trade agreement.
In the meantime, the Prime Minister of India says he and Canada's Mark Carney have had a very productive meeting.
Power shifts rarely announce themselves with explosions or headlines that scream turning point. They usually arrive quietly, through decisions that look technical on the surface and strategic underneath. Right now, one of those shifts is unfolding far from Washington, inside meeting rooms in New Delhi and Ottawa. A deal involving uranium, energy, and long-term trade may not sound dramatic at first glance, yet the consequences reach straight into the core of North American power dynamics. This video is not about symbolism or speeches. It is about leverage, choices, and when pressure stops working. So, what happens when a prime minister decides that pressure from the world's most powerful country no longer deserves automatic obedience? The answer is taking shape in India, and it is forcing policymakers across North America to reassess assumptions that have guided Canadian foreign policy for decades. Canada's strategic independence is no longer theoretical or aspirational. It is being written into contracts, supply chains, and decade-long commitments that do not require approval from Washington. India did not hesitate. Commitments were made, negotiations accelerated, and timelines compressed. The result is a level of tension that few analysts expected to see this quickly. The trigger was not subtle. Donald Trump threatened sweeping 100% tariffs if Canada moved forward with trade arrangements involving China. The expectation in Washington, on Wall Street, and among many foreign policy analysts was predictable. Ottawa would slow down, issue reassurances, and quietly retreat back into familiar dependency. That assumption collapsed in real time. Instead of backing away, the Canadian government accelerated discussions with India, the world's fastest-growing major democracy, and a country that understands economic pressure because it has lived under it for years. The agreements scheduled for March are not symbolic gestures designed for headlines. They reflect a fundamental shift in how Canada views its place in global trade and energy markets. For decades, the default calculation was simple: keep Washington comfortable, even if that meant limiting independent partnerships. That logic no longer governs decision-making in Ottawa. The belief that Canada would fold under American pressure proved wrong, and the speed of the response caught nearly everyone off guard. New Delhi became the focal point of this shift last weekend when India's High Commissioner to Canada, Dinesh K. Patnaik, confirmed that Prime Minister Mark Carney is expected to visit India in the first week of March. The agenda includes agreements on uranium, energy, critical minerals, artificial intelligence, and advanced technology cooperation. The meaning behind those topics is impossible to ignore. Canada is signaling that intimidation no longer sets the boundaries of its foreign policy. What follows explains why coalitions among middle powers are beginning to reshape global trade while threats from Washington steadily lose effectiveness. Between Carney's appearance at the World Economic Forum in Davos this January and the planned India visit in March, Canadian diplomacy entered unfamiliar territory. Trump applied pressure. Carney refused to yield. India, methodical and long-term in its strategy, stepped into the role many countries now seek: a stable partner that does not weaponize uncertainty. This is not improvisation. It is deliberate, calculated, and rooted in the belief that reliance on a single power has become a liability rather than a safeguard. At Davos in January 2026, Carney stood before an audience accustomed to polished consensus and predictable rhetoric. Instead, he delivered a message that broke through the usual noise. The standing ovation was not ceremonial. It reflected recognition. Carney argued that the traditional rules-based international system no longer provides certainty, and that middle powers must build coalitions capable of delivering fairness and stability on their own terms. The speech spread rapidly because it articulated a reality many governments privately acknowledge. American reliability has eroded, and waiting for it to return carries unacceptable risk. The reaction was swift. Within 48 hours, Canada announced an agreement with China that reduced tariffs on electric vehicles and canola, unlocking approximately $7 billion in export opportunities. The objective was explicit: double non-US exports over the next decade. This was not rhetoric designed for applause. It was a measurable target backed by policy action. Trump responded by threatening punitive tariffs, framing the China deal as a provocation. The expectation was compliance. Carney's response mattered more than the threat itself. Canada reaffirmed its commitment to USMCA, provisions that restrict formal free trade agreements with non-market economies, while pointing out that targeted bilateral tariff reductions remain fully legal. Then came the move that changed the entire equation. A high-profile visit to India was scheduled, signaling that diversification would accelerate rather than pause. What awaits in New Delhi goes far beyond ceremonial diplomacy. The centerpiece is a 10-year uranium supply agreement, valued at approximately $2.8 billion. This positions Canada as a primary supplier for India's expanding civilian nuclear energy program. India faces enormous growth in electricity demand, driven by industrial expansion and urbanization. Nuclear power plays a central role in meeting that demand while managing emissions. Securing a stable uranium supply is not optional for India. It is strategic infrastructure. Canada's Energy Minister, Tim Hodgson, traveled to India ahead of Carney's visit to prepare the ground. His message was straightforward. Canada is prepared to sell uranium under the existing Canada-India Nuclear Cooperation Agreement, provided international atomic energy safeguards are respected. Hodgson acknowledged India's status as a major nuclear nation with ambitious plans to expand civilian use. The implication is clear. Canada intends to anchor itself in India's energy future for at least a decade. Uranium is only the opening chapter. Pat Knight confirmed that Carney will also sign agreements covering nuclear cooperation, oil and gas, environmental initiatives, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, education, and cultural exchange. Energy and mining partnerships are expected to dominate announcements, with critical minerals and liquefied natural gas transactions at the center. These are not speculative discussions. They are supply relationships designed to last. There's another layer that gives this partnership added significance. Carney is repairing a diplomatic rupture that stalled Canada-India relations for years. In 2023, former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau accused the Indian government of involvement in the killing of Sikh separatist leader Hardeep Singh Nijjar on Canadian soil. India rejected the allegation. Diplomatic relations deteriorated, and trade negotiations that had taken years to build froze almost overnight. Carney inherited the fallout and moved quickly to stabilize the relationship. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi attended the G7 summit at Carney's personal invitation. Canadian ministers traveled to India to reopen dialogue. India's Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal and Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman are expected to visit Canada soon. India's National Security Advisor is scheduled to arrive in Ottawa next month for intelligence exchanges and security discussions. On the Nijjar case, Pat Knight acknowledged ongoing court proceedings in Canada involving 4 individuals accused of the murder. He stated that if evidence emerges linking Indian nationals to the crime, India would act. This language reflects a calculated choice. Legal processes continue while broader strategic cooperation resumes. It is a textbook example of compartmentalized diplomacy. Difficult issues are addressed without allowing them to paralyze an entire relationship. The contrast with Washington's approach is striking. Disagreement quickly escalates into economic confrontation. Threats replace dialogue. Coalitions give way to ultimatums. Canada's engagement with India reflects a different philosophy, one focused on durability rather than dominance. The partnership becomes even more consequential with the announcement that Canada and India will formally launch negotiations for a comprehensive economic partnership agreement in March. Talks that stalled 2 years ago were revived in November. Now the pace has accelerated dramatically. Pat Knight indicated that a CEPA agreement could be signed within a year of formal negotiations beginning. In trade diplomacy, that timeline is extraordinary. Urgency drives the process. Countries facing unpredictable U.S. tariffs are seeking alternatives that provide stability. Pat Knight described the broader context candidly, noting that the international order that once delivered predictability is no longer functioning. Cooperation, he argued, is necessary to shield partners from volatility. The implication was unmistakable. Economic security cannot depend on the mood swings of a single capital. India understands this pressure firsthand. At the same time as talks with Canada accelerate, India and the European Union are preparing to announce the conclusion of long-running negotiations on a free trade pact. New Delhi is constructing multiple pathways to growth that do not rely on American approval. Canada fits neatly into that strategy. Viewed from a distance, Carney's actions follow a consistent pattern. Reduce targeted tariffs with China to unlock billions in exports while respecting USMCA limits. Secure decade-long uranium supply agreements with India. Formalize partnerships on critical minerals. Relaunch comprehensive trade negotiations. Repair diplomatic relationships damaged by previous leadership. Extend engagement to other middle powers, including Australia, where Carney is expected to address Parliament following an invitation from Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. This is not opportunistic deal-making. It is a deliberate effort to build a framework that supports prosperity without default dependence on the United States. Carney's stated goal of doubling non-U.S. exports over the next decade is backed by tangible architecture rather than slogans. Each agreement fits within existing treaty obligations. None violate USMCA. Every move expands options. This leaves Washington with limited leverage. Canceling USMCA would harm American manufacturers as much as Canadian ones. Imposing tariffs invites retaliation and raises costs for American consumers, while Canada redirects exports to Asia and Europe. The more alternatives Canada builds, the less effective threats become. Influence erodes when compliance is no longer the only viable path. When Carney signs agreements in New Delhi in early March, the significance will extend beyond uranium shipments and mineral contracts. The visit will demonstrate that Canada can pursue strategic interests independently, that coalitions among middle powers can provide economic security, and that leadership increasingly comes from those willing to build rather than intimidate.